right. 3. I'll do a bit of an intro and then I'll go into you. Okay. Everybody, welcome to the Voices of Vic Podcast. I am here with Abhay Singh Sachal. He is founder of Break the Divide. That started in 2016. He's also a beauty hockey player, athlete, defenseman for Victoria College, world traveler, climate change. I mean, he's doing a ton with climate change, I'm not going to lie. So I am very pleased to have Abhay here on the podcast. What a resume, man.
Thank you, Carter.
Thank you for coming on.
No, thanks. It's fun to be here.
Yeah,
thanks
100%.
for having me.
No problem. So we're gonna talk about a lot today.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk about a lot today, but I want to start. We were just doing it before all the cameras got on. We were talking about his first goal in intramurals, which was the playoff clinching goal for Victoria College, which I was personally so hyped.
It was fun. It was fun. So, I've been playing intramurals only since third year. I'm in my fourth year right now, right? And back in first year, I just never brought my gear out. So I'm from BC. I never brought my gear out to Toronto. And then COVID hit second semester, first year for me. Second year was completely online. Third year, that's when I started playing intramurals. And I play defense. I play D. Like I don't think I'm a stay-at-home defenseman, but I'm not necessarily like an offensive defenseman either.
No Quinn Hughes here.
No, I'm not. I'm not Cale McCarr. I'm not like Charlie McAvoy. Like I'm a decent maybe Jacob Slavin. I feel like
that works.
That works.
He's on both ends of the ice.
Exactly. I feel like that's pumping me up a bit too much, but my first goal, it was our last game, and I went into the high slot, and I just put it in left side. It was fun. I got a perfect pass from Ben Murphy, though.
Shout out to Ben. Shout out. The whole bench was losing it. When did you start playing hockey?
I started playing hockey when I was 5 or 6 when I was in Hockey 3.
Hockey 3?
I think Hockey 3 or Hockey 4.
What's that?
Isn't that before that? I think that how does it go again? It's hockey.
I think the age divisions are different in BC.
Maybe actually, because it's after Hockey 3 and 4, it was Pee-wee? No, it's Pee-wee Midget Bantam.
Okay.
And then, do you not have that? Pee-wee Midget Bantam?
We got Pee-wee Midget Bantam, but
okay.
Before that we have like novice tyke.
Oh, okay, yeah. I never had that. It was Hockey 3 to Hockey 4. But yeah, I started playing when I was like 5 or 6,
cool.
yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Who got you into hockey? Anyone in your family play?
No. My dad, I think, just put me into hockey, and that was super nice. Like I was like 11 months old when we moved to Canada, so grew up in BC. And my brother is 7 years older than me, so he was like 7 or 8 when we moved from India. And so I was born in India, but I remember when I was like 5 or 6 years old, my parents just put me into hockey. They also put me into piano around the same time. But one of the things is my brother, my parents couldn't actually afford to put my brother into hockey when he was like 7 and 8 when they had just moved, because they were just like getting work and all of those things. And so I was actually really lucky to be able to start playing hockey. And I think my dad, I think he was just like, okay, hockey, this is Canada. Like, let's get you playing. And I've loved hockey since, yeah. That
is awesome. Do you ever go back to India? Like, are you tied close to your Indian roots?
So I think it's interesting. So I'm from a state in India called Punjab. That's where my family is from. And, I've gone a few times. I wouldn't say I necessarily go back, though, I think if I'm going back home, that's BC for me. Whereas I'm definitely tied to certain aspects of my family. Like, again, both of my parents, they were sort of the first people in their families to really leave and, go for themselves. And I think I was thinking about it the other day. I think my dad was 27 and my mom was 25 or something when they left everything and started a new life. It's I'm 21 right now.
That's all right.
I can't imagine dropping everything and moving to Greece randomly, or I don't know, moving to Romania or something like that. It's something that is really interesting. So I'd say I'm definitely tied to a lot of different aspects of myself, but I think my story involves me being from Punjab in India. That's where my family is from. My grandfather was in the Indian partition. He was 20 years old when that happened. So when the British were leaving India, they split India and Pakistan into two, despite them being one country originally. My grandpa was on the Pakistan side. And so both of his parents were killed in the violence. 3 of his siblings were killed. And at 20 years old, he started a life for himself. And I recently found out that he was actually going to go to law school in the UK, but he couldn't at that point anymore because he had to support his entire family. So it's really interesting just learning and connecting with sort of that side of my heritage and that my history, and it's cool to learn about that. But I definitely think that that's an important part of me. But there's so many different parts of me too.
We're getting to the age where, like you just said, your parents moved here when they're 25, 26. Yeah. Your grandpa was starting a completely new life when he was 20.
Yeah.
We're getting to the age where we can look at what our parents were doing at those age and compare, like, where are we compared to them? And your grandpa, he obviously sounds like he went through a ton there, a lot.
And then he joined the military.
That's crazy, man. That's like, he went through a lot. Your parents too, moving here, that's got to be a big challenge, a lot of struggle. And now here you are getting into your 20s, and you are taking this climate change thing by storm. You're on every single page I see about the government of Canada.
Did you Google me, Carter?
I did some research. I did some research before I had this amazing guest on. But how'd you get into climate change? What motivated you to start looking into that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, growing up, again, and I'm going to sound like a typical person from BC here, but like growing up in BC, I'm from Surrey, BC, suburb of Vancouver. It's a lot like Brampton. Like, this is what I tell people in Ontario. And when I say it's a lot like Brampton, Surrey is a very sort of immigrant heavy community. I think like in my specific area of Surrey, Newton, there's a statistic that's like 60% of people were born outside of like Canada. And so that's like a very high number. And so it's largely South Asian people. And so growing up in Surrey, I was able to connect with the environment. This is sort of like on another note. I was able to connect with the environment because I had the ocean on one side, the forests like right in the middle, and the mountains on the other side. And like I remember my dad taking me for walks and just being in nature, like at different parks and all of that. And I remember learning about climate change when I was very young, like in elementary school and early high school. And I just wanted to do something about it. Like I was a part of my school's green team and things like that. And what really sort of elevated my interest in climate change to the next level was in 2016. And I don't know if I've told you this story. Like in 2016, I had this really cool chance to travel to the Arctic. And this was through a Canadian organization called the Students on Ice Foundation. They're still running. So everyone can check them out. And essentially what they do is they run expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic every year. So I was 14 years old, and someone introduced it to me, and I was like, I can apply. Why not? Like, what's the worst that can happen?
14-year-old Abhay going on a suicide mission to the Arctic, man.
No. And I had built it up in my mind. I was like, I'm going to be in the wild. Yeah. I'm going to be like foraging for food. No, I ended up applying, and I got a scholarship to go to the Arctic, and that was incredible. And it was me and 100 different students from around the world. Again, people from ages 14 to like 30 as young people. I was basically like one of the youngest there. And so that was a big experience for me. And it was also 100 different like educators. So scientists, historians, musicians, like all sorts of people from all over the world. But there were a lot of Canadians too. I think it was like 100 of the 200 were from Canada. And that was very cool. And I got to see climate change firsthand when I was in the Arctic. Like I saw glaciers melting in front of my eyes. I saw polar bears. I saw all sorts of amazing wildlife. And more than any of that, though, like you might think, oh my God, I saw the polar bears. The polar bears are dying. I mean, that's what we hear when we think of climate change. Maybe less so today, but back in 2016, I think the language around climate change was still very much of like the idea that like climate change is going to come in the future. Whereas like since 2016, like past 7 years, we've seen extreme weather, not just around the world, but like in Canada every year. Yeah. And so I think seeing climate change in that way was very interesting at like a purely environmental level. And like, but the thing is, I started learning like with polar bears, for example, yes, polar bears are experiencing some difficulties, but polar bears are also just migrating south. And they're not just completely dying off. They're migrating further south into people's communities, into Inuit communities. And polar bears, I don't know, like if you know anything about polar bears are like incredibly dangerous.
I had no idea that the polar bears were coming. That's crazy.
They're migrating south. And like when I say south, I'm not saying they're coming to Toronto.
No,
like
but eventually, who knows?
And so the thing is, polar bears are actually posing a threat now to people's livelihoods, to people's communities, to people's well-being. And so for me, I actually started listening to my Inuit friends. The Inuit are indigenous to the Arctic. So my Inuit friends, they were talking to me about how climate change has been impacting their communities for like the past 20, 30 years. It's not new. And so when I learned about that, I was just sort of shocked. like they were talking about how because permafrost is melting, permafrost is like the layer of like frozen soil that's like always present in any Arctic region in the world, in the tundra. Like this is sort of my like grade 6 geography coming back. The permafrost is melting unevenly, and so pipes beneath the surface are actually breaking because of the melting soil. Houses are like becoming uneven and breaking. People that like in the past had very predictable sort of patterns of when to go hunting for seal on the like very stable ice are coming back either injured or they're not coming back at all because the patterns are no longer stable at all. So again, at 14, learning about these very sort of tangible, real impacts to my friends when it comes to climate change, that was sort of a game changer for me.
That is a very good point. And like, I'm going to want to make a clip about that polar bear thing because that's when you hear about climate change, it's very future. The world is going to be in a chaotic situation. And everyone talks about I hear a lot about the future impacts, about how even if it's not, people don't treat it as a big deal today. I mean, just like the average person doesn't go around thinking about it. It's people focus on the future a lot. But when you bring up that polar bears are literally moving, like that makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. They need to migrate south and they're just rolling up into these communities.
Exactly.
That is dangerous.
And killing people.
That is dangerous.
It's not good.
That is crazy. But going back to that future thing, when you are working on action, whatever, policy suggestions on how what we're going to do about these issues. Yeah. Because it's not one issue, it's a lot of issues that come with climate change. Is it very much focused on the future? Like how big of an impact is climate change having today? Obviously, you gave that good story, but is it more of a future issue or is it really like a problem right now?
That's a really good question. There are so many ways that climate change is a problem right now. Like one of the big things that, again, I learned in the Arctic was climate change has very big impacts on health, whether it's sort of physical health. Like it comes to infectious disease, there's more and more infectious disease now. And like malaria is showing up in regions where malaria never showed up before because like the environment is changing and weather patterns are changing and these viruses, these diseases are able to survive in different climates. That's one example. If we think of physical health beyond diseases, there's also just things like air pollution and sort of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. It's not good for people to be breathing in more and more sort of pollutants. Those are some very tangible things when it comes to physical health, and that's happening around the world today. If you think of sort of physical health too, climate change results in more extreme weather consistently. So whether that's hurricanes, tornadoes, extreme flooding, droughts, wildfires, like you name it, if you think of any sort of big weather storm or extreme weather event that's happened over the past 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, climate change has in large part made those situations a lot worse than they would have been had our climate not been changing at the way that it has been because of human-induced activity. I think that's the big thing too, that like us pumping fossil fuels into the atmosphere is like causing this. And so again, not to get too technical or scientific, but like I think when you think of the fact that there are floods going on, there are wildfires, and climate change is playing a large part in this, it makes sense why we call climate change a climate crisis today, because it's impacting real people. Like health, but well-being and livelihoods. Like if you're a farmer in rural Ontario, you're seeing changes every single day. You're seeing that, crops may not be growing as much as they used to, or there may be a different season that you're not prepared for of like crops and when they're growing. And so that has major impacts, now we're not just talking about individual people. We're talking about like systems at large. We're talking about agriculture, food, transport, our entire economies. And so there are many sort of downstream effects, like many impacts of the sort of base level of climate change. And it's causing more poverty, more income inequality. Like there are so many issues. One particular issue that I really care about and I think about a lot is how climate change impacts mental health. And so upon initial thought, you might initially be like, okay, but mental health and climate change, how are they connected? I was initially exposed to this idea of climate change impacting mental health when I was in the Arctic, because many of my Inuit friends were talking about how suicide rates in their communities are 11 times higher than the Canadian national average.
Jeez.
Like, think about that.
That's crazy.
And so a lot of that stems from sort of historical remnants of colonialism. Like, residential schools, but not just that, land relocation, like forced assimilation, erasure of language, culture. And again, this was so fascinating to me, the idea that culture for Inuit communities in the Arctic is about land preservation. It's about environmental values. Like, as a part of culture, they are taking care of the environment. They're living sustainably. And that has been eliminated. So if we think of sort of colonialism and assimilation, it's erased culture and traditions and knowledge, but it's also erased very particular sort of ways that can help us, guide us on the path to a more sustainable future. And so learning from them about that erasure, colonialism was connected to climate change in the sense that because the Inuit in the Arctic, they're not contributing a lot to carbon emissions, right? Like,
I don't think so.
if you're thinking of people around the world, actually, the most impoverished people in the world that are experiencing the worst effects of climate change, including the Inuit who are experiencing the most impacts of climate change in the Arctic, they barely contributed and continue to barely contribute to carbon emissions and climate change, yet they experience the brunt of the impact. And it's us sort of in the south of Canada, the United States, the UK, the developed European world, most of the sort of developed West that has profited off of extraction of fossil fuels, and now the impacts are in different places. And so that's sort of just like when we think about climate justice, this is what it's all about, actually. The fact that my friends in the Arctic are experiencing mental health challenges because of climate change, even though they did nothing to cause it. Like, think about that. Like, you doing nothing of your own fault and experiencing the worst possible situation.
Yeah, no,
right?
that's not fair.
It's not fair, and obviously it's unjust. And so when we think of mental health and climate change, it's not just people that are far away. I have struggled with sort of climate anxiety, feelings of overwhelm. When I was in the Arctic, there was this one moment, and I tell the story quite a bit, but there was this one moment at the Ilulissat ice fjord. This is a place where like ice is stretched out for kilometers and kilometers, as far as your eyes can see. And all 200 of us on this expedition, we were all together looking at these icebergs, and all 200 of us went silent for a second. We went silent, and we could literally hear the icebergs melting. So, like, it was millions of drops of water going into the freshest body of water that exists while we're on top of the world, literally. And so for me, that moment was overwhelming. Like, I felt like the burden of solving climate change was on my shoulders. I know as young people, we often feel like we have the burden to solve all the world's issues, that the world's in crisis and we got to fix everything. And it took coming back home and understanding that there is so much that is being done. There is so much resilience out there that comes from culture, that comes from community, that we can learn from. So climate change and mental health, climate emotions, we all feel a way about the world and the way that the world's changing. For some people, that's anxiety about the future. Like, should I have kids? Should I not have kids? Is it ethical to bring up kids in a world that we might not know is safe in the future? Some people feel grief. Like, I feel a lot of loss because that river that used to flow through my community has like gone away because of drought. Sometimes it's like this term called solastalgia, which is a place-based homesickness where you might be in your same physical location, but the environment around you has changed so much that it doesn't feel like home. Solastalgia, grief. A lot of people deal with hypocrisy, feeling like I'm contributing to the problem, yet I don't want to. Feelings of guilt, like I don't deserve to feel guilty, or I don't deserve to have mental health sort of like worries. And so there's so many emotions that come with climate change that we really need to pay attention. So to answer your question, after that long story, climate change has real impacts today. Yes, we need to think about the future and adapt to the effects that are going to happen, mitigate sort of the future effects of climate change, which means reducing our carbon emissions. And in that process, don't forget about people. Like, there are people whose lives and livelihoods depend on the oil and gas industry, especially in Canada. We can't forget about those people. It's not like, okay, bye, you have no job. No, it's like, how can we bring people along? But apart from the future and all the action that goes into the future, there are very real things that we need to be thinking about today as well.
That makes sense. Solastalgia. I'd never heard of that. That's actually super interesting how, like you said, okay, it's a homesickness. I'm going to repeat what you said because I think it's important for people to think about that. Homesickness, that it doesn't result in you necessarily being away from home, but the home itself has changed.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. So I'll ask you this. Why is it? I don't think that there are people out there who really, I mean, there are some, but credible people who are denying the fact that the climate is changing. I think that's obvious. I think the disagreement comes by how much of it is human induced. So I want to get your opinion that there is definitely human contribution, but how much of it is really caused by us?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is not my opinion because I'm not a climate scientist. I'm in my 4th year of undergrad at UT. I study global health and peace, conflict, and justice, right? Like, I'm not even in environmental studies. The science and the data, and if you look at historical records, if humans had not existed on this world, if we had not, or sorry, not even if humans hadn't existed, if humans did not extract and sort of pollute the way that we have since the Industrial Revolution, the climate would not be changing the way that it is right now. We wouldn't see this increase in global average temperature. Like, that's what the trends and everything show. And if you look at a graph, sort of a timeline of like global annual temperature up until the Industrial Revolution, it's sort of stable. Like, yeah, there's ups and downs. Like, there's the Ice Age and there's other things. That's all sort of in natural cycle of the Earth's rhythm. All of a sudden, when you get to the Industrial Revolution, you see a giant spike. And so even if you just think of the past 20 years, I think something like 18 of the past 20 years have been like the hottest years in history, in human recorded history. And so I think that's telling us something. And so I think the question of how much do humans contribute to it, it's a good question. I think the science is actually settled on that question too, that like we're seeing the impacts of climate change and humans have caused so much of it, if not all. And that means that we have to act. And the thing is, we also know what to do. So we know why the problem exists. We know what the problem exists, how it shows up, and we know what to do. What's next? Do the action. And that's where it gets a bit more complicated.
Yeah. It's crazy that there is an opposition. Like, with climate change, you would think that everyone's going to just go ahead and say, we want the Earth to be in a healthy state, the environment to be in a good state.
Yeah.
But I don't. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
If I were to come up and say, I want to make a statement that is going to unite the people, that everyone's going to come and agree with.
Yeah.
And that's a very hard thing to do, first of all.
Totally.
But let's try to think of something super easy. Cookies taste good. Cake tastes good. Okay, let's say that. Cake tastes good. That will unite the people. Everyone loves cake. Who doesn't love cake? I think the issue is not with people rejecting that cake tastes good. I think people are trying to reject the implication that comes with the statement. So there will be some people that say we should not unite behind the fact that cake tastes good because
that means that the government will force everyone to eat cake 5 times a day.
Sure. Or cake is unhealthy. Maybe we should unite behind something else. So my thing with climate change is that some people, the people who are, I guess, pushing back on this idea, and I think I don't know how many people are. It might be a minority, I'd say. But the ones who are, I think, are worried about the other impacts that climate policy could have on the world. So, whenever I think about these policies that the government are putting in, it sounds like there are the environmental scientists going up against the economists, and they kind of have this back and forth. How much do you take in, at least to consideration, other factors like the economy and the current state of pretty much, let's say unemployment is also a big deal.
Yeah.
How much of that is considered when we're thinking about solutions?
Totally. That's a good question. I would say the people that are making these decisions are thinking about everything. So I'm on the Environment and Climate Change Canada Youth Council, ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada. They're one of the government's biggest departments. They have sort of hundreds, if not thousands, of staff. And this includes people that are like meteorologists, weather analysts, all sorts of people, but also people working on policy. These are not people that are only looking at the environment. Like, they're not only looking at trees and nature and plants and whatever. Like, those things are important, but they're also thinking about economies and society, like our society at large. When we think of sort of the ways that decisions are made, we are looking at a lot of different things. So I think when it comes to sort of like how we think about climate action, I definitely do agree. There are so many genuine reasons that people are worried. And people, like, there's so much genuine reason that, like, we don't know that we should trust what's changing and, like, how we're going to act. And people feel like they're going to be left behind. That's very fair. Like, that's so, I mean, yeah, it's fair. I don't even know what else to say. It's like, I understand that concern because something might happen and then you might be out of a job, or your family might be out of a job, or something that you're so tied to may not exist anymore. Like the Edmonton Oilers, right? Like the Oilers refers to oil rigs. It refers to like extraction of natural gas from the environment.
Yeah.
And like I don't love the Oilers. I'm a Canucks fan. I mean, I like Connor McDavid and stuff, but
Great player.
10 out of 10. Kel McCarr's good too, though.
Shout out to Kel McCarr.
If he watches this, like,
Kel McCarr's watching this.
He's from Alberta. I think he's from Brooks, Alberta.
Yeah.
Brooks. If we think of sort of the people that are reliant on industries that climate action would sort of supposedly eliminate, I think those people are as much the victims of bad messaging and bad sort of faith actors as much as anything else. So here's what I mean by this. When we think of people, like you said, this is what you said, like if something like we should all protect our environment should be something that we can all come around. The problem is there are sort of bodies of actors, networks of people that have teamed up with the intent of making sure that a specific policy does not pass. And in many cases, this is to protect their profits. There's research that shows that the biggest oil companies, especially in America, and I know in Canada too, have sort of produced research and produced findings and lobbied governments and doing some things in some very corrupt ways that have prevented climate action, that have made this issue a lot more unclear than it needs to be, because the science has been pretty clear since 1970, 1980, actually. And so if we think of Esso and Shell and these big companies that have actually delayed sort of climate action, that's a lot like tobacco companies that delayed the banning of like cigarettes, or informing people that cigarettes are cancerous. Like the scientists knew that cigarettes were going to cause cancer, but they weren't able to sort of fully convey their message because of these bad faith actors. And what I mean by this is classic denialism. Denialism is actually a sort of political and institutional way that organizations and people come together and they essentially create actions that result in a policy not being done. And so to simplify it, if I don't want the policy of everyone has to eat cake to be passed, I can start spreading rumors that cake actually cake is actually, I don't know. It
makes you obese. After one slice.
After one slice. Let's say I say that. That's not really true, but I can spread enough uncertainty that people actually start to question it. And as people question it more and more, then action that seems like everyone should agree on becomes a lot less certain. And so I think what's so important is, yes, let's think about the economy. Like economics actually show that when we're thinking of climate change again, that we will produce more jobs if we take climate action now, because the world is going to need to diversify beyond just fossil fuels. I mean, at the very minimum, if we think of fossil fuels, like they're a non-renewable resource. That means that they're going to be eliminated eventually. So why not move that transition towards greener energy like hydro, like solar, like wind as fast as possible? And I'm not saying that it's going to be 100% tomorrow. I'm saying, though, that we need to start taking those serious actions. And I think the people that are sort of in charge, yes, they do some of that. But I think this is why, as young people especially, because we are inheriting the world that's coming up. You know, the people that are 70 and 80 right now, they're not going to be here in 50 years to see what the climate looks like. And if we continue on the track that we're on, we're not going to be in a place where our kids can sort of like breathe freely, that we're sort of immune from the worst impacts of climate change, even in developed countries. And I think this is the exact thing. Like, we tend to think of ourselves as individuals, but not as the global community, or even as a Canadian community. There are people that are being impacted right now. If they're already having their lives destroyed, what will happen in 20, 30 years? We can't forget about those people. We need those voices to be sort of at the forefront of how we think about how we take climate action.
Man, you know your stuff. You know what you're talking about. That's for sure.
I've been thinking about it for a bit.
Okay, yeah.
Again, honestly, Carter, like the last thing I'll say on this is like climate change is a big thing that people hear about a lot. There are real impacts. And again, we see them. Like we see the extreme cold, the extreme heat. Again, like I'm from Surrey, BC. In the summer of 2020, there was constant smoke from wildfires, because of wildfires that were burning in Alberta that were in large part climate change induced. And so, like, think about the impacts that constant smoke has on you. Like, it's not good. And we all sort of recognize that. The question of what we do now is one of how do we come together and create sort of solutions that work for multiple people, that don't leave people behind, that bring people along, but also target that issue of justice. Like, who is most impacted and how do we support them?
Makes sense. And I think a huge advantage that you have is you actually saw it when you were young. You saw it with your own eyes. That's the thing. And there are a lot of skeptics out there. Skepticism can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. It's really just keeps you on edge.
Yeah.
But when it comes to something like this, you actually went, you physically saw the impact it was having on the world. I respect you so much because you are going and you're working with the government, like you said. And these problems can only be tackled. Personally, I think that it has to be tackled at a government level. What do you think the individual can do, if anything, that is going to help this? Is it an individual issue, or is it like you're going and you're working with the government because these are powerful people who can do the things that you're talking about?
I think this actually comes to a really important point of the feeling of powerlessness that leads to hopelessness. Like, if I can't do anything, how am I supposed to feel hopeful? Because I don't know what the people in charge are doing. Like, I don't think they're competent. Let's say like that's what you're thinking. If that's how you feel, then it makes sense that you don't want to take action. And this is actually, again, science and the research on this shows that when people are sort of constantly bombarded with information that makes you fearful, then you're not going to act. Because when you're fearful, what do? You curl up and you don't take action. It's when you feel empowered and hopeful and strong and with other people, when you have people in your corner, that's when you feel like you can take action. So I think it's more than just a government level of action, actually. It's every part of our society, and individuals play a big role in that, because each one of us as individuals has certain scopes and places of influence. We're all sort of leaders, I'll say, and not to sound cliche, like we're all leaders. We all sort of have places of influence, whether that's within our family, within our community, within your sort of local group, within your sports team, within your province, within your country. Like, the thing is, these sort of movements add up, and if you can build sort of connections within people around you and just get these conversations going at the bare minimum, like, okay, I care about this, what can we do? That's when you can build up and create something bigger and bigger. And I mean, again, after coming back from the Arctic, like, it's not like I was involved in government right away, actually. I was really lucky to have the support of my high school teachers and people around me. And we started a project called Break the Divide, where we were connecting youth at my high school in BC with students in the Arctic and Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. And in doing those conversations, we did more of that sharing of the local impacts of climate change. Long story short, with so much support from different people and people being interested, we expanded that Break the Divide approach of connecting different communities to go from a place of apathy to empathy to action to students around the world. So we had chapters in Cape Town, South Africa, in Bolivia, in Taiwan, in China, in India, in all these different places. We had a chapter in Russia back in 2018 where we were talking to a small art school. And students there, although they didn't speak English, we were doing art together. And so things like that, that's what the sort of Break the Divide approach was built on, the sort of empathy building and connection. That wasn't government. That was me as a young person and other young people like me coming together. And I think when it comes to climate action, we can sort of do that. We're both on a hockey team. I guess we can think of things like, how can we reduce our carbon emissions as a hockey team? And if the project works, if what we do does make a difference, then we can scale it. So I think we're taught not to think small. We're taught to think, how can we change the world? But that starts with yourself. It starts with the people around you. And I think when you can build that sort of community, you can create a lot more action.
That's a good point. That was a good response to the question. That it does. Everyone can make their own small impact, which all it takes. I mean, if the entire world starts thinking this way, then
here's
basically fix
the thing, though, Carter. And I recognize that as I'm saying this, there's so much privilege in being able to say that climate action is actually sort of at the top of my concerns, because for so many people in the world, in Canada, in our communities, there are so many more pressing concerns to think about. If you can't put food on the table, you're not going to have time or space or mental energy to think about climate action. If you're experiencing racism on a daily basis, this is not the top of your concern. If you're disabled and you can't actually function in your life because the systems around you aren't set up for success, this is not the biggest of the concerns. But what I'd say is, that's why I think action on these different issues are so connected. Issues of disability justice are so connected to issues of climate justice, actually. Because if we think of a natural disaster, who are the people that are left behind? Disabled people, disabled folk who like can't walk, who need extra support, for example. As a society, we tend to leave those people behind when a natural disaster happens. In Turkey, the earthquake that happened, a lot of people that died were people in wheelchairs, people with sort of mental disabilities, people that weren't able to support themselves and were left behind. And so that's where I see that the issue of disability justice, advocating for more accessibility, advocating for more support, advocating for sort of opportunity for people to like achieve success, that's where that's connected to climate change. And same thing with racial justice, same thing with whatever issue that you think of. They're all really connected. And so I think like if you can't think of climate action and think of that in your own community, there are ways to advocate for yourself, for the people around you, and for the people that you care about.
What is your motivation to be doing all this? You talked about how climate change is having severe mental impacts on people, not just in, north of Canada, but, all around the world.
Yeah.
Are you afraid of this as much as a lot of people are?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, like, I guess I can start with what my fear is when it comes to climate change in particular, but also the related issues. I think like the way that we're headed right now, we're headed to a point where people that can afford to will create sort of isolated, insular communities that are protected from the worst impacts of climate change. And we're sort of already seeing that happen. People that can afford to are building up walls or building up sort of borders so that people that need support can't come in. Like I was in Fiji this past summer, and I was doing an environmental internship in Fiji. And when I was learning from people in Fiji, one of the things that came up so much was the fact that the Pacific Island nations are sinking. Like the sea levels are rising. Kiribati, Tuvalu, these are two countries that are actually like physically sinking, and people are having to migrate. And people in Fiji are also experiencing that. The coastal regions of Fiji, of the Fijian Islands, are sinking. They're going underwater. And so what about all the people that are there? This is going to create a concern, and it already is, of climate refugees around the world, of billions of people over the next decades that are going to need to migrate to countries like Canada, the United States, to wealthier countries. And we have to have systems in place ready to welcome these people and integrate them as a part of our society, to let people exist together and like learn from one another and turn Canada into the society that we want it to be. I'm very interested. So to answer your question, Carter, about sort of my motivations, I mean, I think there's many. I see these issues that are connected, and I see potential for myself. I see potential for the world to be able to take action. I mean, I care about learning from other people. I think doing this sort of work allows me to do that with Break the Divide, building that up and like fostering empathy between different communities. I think that's important. With climate action, I think that's important. Mental health. These are things that are important. They've definitely impacted me personally, whether I think about climate change, mental health, whether I think of like empathy and learning. Like I think throughout my life, I've learned from other people, and being in the space that I have, like, I think I've like built bridges with other people at times. Like I'll give you a quick story. When I was growing up, I started playing hockey again when I was 5. By the time I think Pee Wee or Bantam came around, parents weren't allowed in the dressing rooms anymore. That's like Pee Wee, right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
Around Pee Wee.
Around Pee Wee. Yeah.
Because you're like, what, 9, 10 then?
Yeah.
Yeah, around that.
My mom wasn't too happy about it. She liked, tying the skates, but we had to figure that out.
No, exactly. And like, I had my dad tie my skates. My mom would help sometimes. My brother would, right? Like, you can't do that when you're like 6 years old.
Yeah.
And I remember when Pee Wee started, parents weren't allowed in the locker rooms anymore. And so when I was little, I'd wear like a turban like this, but it was smaller. It was sort of like a thinner cloth that just covered my hair. And I would take that off to put my helmet on. And like, I have very long hair. My hair's like sort of this long. It's very thick. It's very luscious.
But he's got flow.
Yeah.
He's got the flow. For a hockey player, yo.
And so that stems from my faith, my religion. As a practicing Sikh, I don't cut my hair. And so at 10 years old, or however young I was, whenever I took my helmet off, or whenever I took my turban off to put my helmet on, I had long hair. And actually, kids would tease me sometimes on my team. They'd say like, oh, like, you have such long hair, you a girl, things like that. Things would be said. And I remember when I was young, these were kids that I actually knew, though. I had the privilege, again, of being in a place where I felt safe enough to talk to these friends. And like, I talked to them. I was like, oh, like, actually, no, I just have long hair because it's a part of my religion. And I don't cut my hair because, for me, it's really important to keep my hair. It's a part of sort of a spiritual tradition.
You're telling them this at 10.
I mean, I was probably not as eloquently at all.
Genius.
Right? I think I probably just said like, hey, it's a part of my religion and it's part of who I am. Yeah. I think now I can explain that there's so many different aspects of why I don't cut my hair, and wearing a turban, it's a part of my identity as a Sikh. I'm supposed to stand out in a crowd. That's actually the idea of a turban, so that a Sikh is recognizable in a crowd of like a lot of different people. So that's the person that you can go to ask for help. And so it actually, for me, it's like, because I have this identity, I know that I need to like be someone that helps people because I'm sort of bound to that. And I take that challenge actually. Anyways, back to the story at like, again, 10 years old, I remember being able to talk to my friends, and I was very lucky. These are people that listened to me. And so after a little while, the teasing stopped. And so for me, sort of communicating my own experience and talking to other people about that young age, it taught me that, you can talk to different people. Over the time, I've learned that you can only talk to different people when you have that trust built, when you feel safe, when you feel like you're welcome. And I think as a society, we have so much work to do in being able to just create those initial conditions so that we can create an environment where we learn from one another. Like, I've learned so much about like the history of my grandfather and his sort of migration and the history behind that and the politics and the economics that made the partition of India and Pakistan possible. I learned from my Inuit friends in the Arctic. I learned from my friends in Fiji when I went there. The thing is, in order to be able to create these environments and spaces where we can learn, we need to build up that foundation. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about, like building up that foundation of trust and understanding. And that comes from sort of systemic change to change the conditions that get us to where we are in the first place.
I'm impressed, too, that at such a young age, like you tell that story about kids making fun of the long hair on hockey teams. And not a lot of people would be able to just say it's part of my religion. A lot of people would be going on to like tell that as kind of a sad story of being bullied, and you were able to literally just explain it. I in high school, I have a good story about this.
Yeah.
For any young kids out there who are struggling with this is genuinely, like, confidence can protect you from so much. It's crazy. And just being honest with who you are, with your truth about just, standing up for what you believe.
Yeah.
I was in tech class. It was grade 9.
Yeah.
I was in coding class, and I was listening to some music while I did it. We were allowed to listen to music when we were doing certain projects. So I was typing up, and my friend comes over. I had an iPad then. I didn't even have a phone. So I had my iPad with the music plugged in, and my friend comes over. He taps the screen. He looks at it. He's like, "You're listening to Ed Sheeran." I was listening to Ed Sheeran. And I was like, "Oh, it's on a shuffle. It's okay. No, I swear." Because in high school, you're supposed to listen to the rap. You're supposed to listen to whoever. Polo G, Chief Keef. I don't even know these rappers, okay? But you're supposed to be listening to these guys who are talking about who knows what, a bunch. And here's me, grade 9, and I'm trying to defend my friend that I'm listening to Ed Sheeran. It's a good song. I don't know what it was. Perfect. Something Sing. One of the songs by Ed Sheeran. Great singer. Shout out to Ed if he's listening. But anyways, because he was my friend, we were on the same hockey team too. Yeah. We'd go to practice, and once again, we were in grade 9, and his name's Ali. I'll shout out. He's not a mean guy. He was my friend, but he was teasing me for Ed Sheeran, and I was trying to defend it to him. Yeah. Anyways, later at practice, he tells Jake, who's a grade 12 kid that's on our team, and he said to Jake, he's like, "Yo, Carter listens to Ed Sheeran. You know that?" And then all Jake does, who's like the older kid, we look up to the older kids, whatever. All Jake says is like, "What's wrong with Ed Sheeran?" And Ali goes, "What?" He's like, "Well, what's wrong with Ed Sheeran?" That's all he had to say. And I was like, no way. And then Ali's like, "Oh, I guess, Ed Sheeran's not terrible. Oh, you sure? He's got some good songs." And there he is defending Ed Sheeran now to this older guy. And I was like, is that really all it takes? All you had to say was, "Bro, Ed Sheeran's not bad. He's cool. He's got some good lines, good songs." That's all you got to do, is you just stick up. If you crumble and if you start, falling for whatever sort of category or label that they're trying to put on you, that listening to Ed Sheeran makes you whatever, then you lose. Yeah. But if you did what Jake did, What's wrong with that cheering?
And
that's all it takes.
That's the thing. If you look at Jake in that scenario, he's someone that you guys looked up to that had power in that situation. So I think that speaks to, like, if you're in an instance where you have power, where people look up to you, or you have sort of power that's sort of unseen or that's not talked about. If you have power, then use that power to help other people. Like, I think about this a lot when I think of sort of my presence on this land. Like, I'm a settler on Canadian land. And so being from BC, I'm a settler on unceded territory, which means it was never formally given up. In Ontario, the treaties were signed in bad faith, learning about that history. And so I recognize that as someone who's a settler to this land, I have benefited so much from being Canadian. I've had so many opportunities. I've been able to, like, represent Canada at international scales a few different times. And I've received so much from being Canadian. Like, even if we just think about me playing hockey growing up, that's been such a big part of who I am. At the expense of my benefit has come so much harm for Indigenous peoples of this land. People that have had, again, their cultures erased, identities eliminated, cultural and physical genocide too. When we think about missing and murdered Indigenous women, clean drinking water and reserves still not being there to this day. Like, there are many issues that we think about that are here because we get to benefit from being on this land. When I think about that, that reminds me that it's actually my obligation, because I'm someone that has benefited from this land, to give back, and not just give back, actually to create justice and to work towards creating a society where everyone, and especially Indigenous peoples, can, like, achieve success in the ways that you and I can, and not having the sort of institutional barriers that exist. And so I think, like, when it comes to individual instances where, like, someone may be teasing you, I was so fortunate because I'd actually been able to, like, play hockey with the guys on my team for quite a while before that happened. But for someone that was new there, like, let's say this was my first season ever, and, like, I might have quit hockey if I didn't really, like, feel safe. And I think that's where people who sort of have power, like, someone with power could have been my coach in that room, could have been another player, could have been someone like a white person, you know, like, if we think about the ways that actually race or gender or, like, things like that do make a difference. If you're a man in a room full of other men and one woman that's being teased or something like that, like, you can step up, and you ought to. And I think when we think of things that are sort of inalienable parts of people, like, the fact that I am a practicing Sikh is a part of me. The fact that I'm a man is a part of me. The fact that, you know, I'm a racialized person, you know, I'm racialized as not being white. That's something that happens in our society. When someone sees me, they might think, oh, where's this person from? They're from India. Like, that happens. And Carter, you know me, like, you know, I'm from BC. Someone who doesn't know me might not know that. And the fact is, like, in Canada, for example, white people are not actually thought to be from somewhere else, the same way that people of color, racialized people are. That's just a reality. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is actually that, like, that means that we have opportunities to create change, that if you have power, if you have people that look up to you, like Jake in that situation, you can make a difference. And so that's where I see that it's not just the individual. Like, I wouldn't say if I quit hockey back then because people were teasing me, I don't think that would make me weak. I think it means that the society around me is weak, and the society hasn't built the people around me and myself strong enough to be able to be resilient. And I think that's when I think of resilience as a society and as communities. Like, it's us coming together to build people up. And I think that's what this entire idea of, like, justice that we've been talking about, whether it's climate, racial, like, whatever sort of disability, all sorts of justice, it all comes together there.
That's a good point. I will say that I want to get your opinion on this too. Do you think that building people up societally is more effective than building them up individually? Like, when you get on here and you speak about every topic we've covered so far, I mean, climate change, all this stuff, are people going to resonate more with the message of stand up for what you believe and don't get pushed around by people at school, people on a hockey team?
Yeah.
Or do you think that just trying to fix the society works? Because I think that, I mean, personally, if you feel like you have control over your own situation, that might get you a nice, faster, you know, fix to a lot of the issues you're facing instead of waiting on society. You know what I mean?
No, I hear you. I totally hear you. I think the thing is, we are society. Like, you, me, anyone around us. Like, we make up the community that we're a part of. And so we hold spaces and opportunities to create influence. Like, I definitely agree that as an individual, it's important to feel empowered and it's important to build yourself up. Like, again, for me, I was only able to be like, hey, you know, I have long hair and I wear a turban because of my religion, because I actually had the good fortune of my parents being able to like explain that to me and teach me about that at a young age. A lot of people don't have that. A lot of people don't have that because of the conditions around them. And that's where I think of like society, that like there are actual things around us that don't allow us to reach our peak, whether that's a lack of funds, whether that's racism in society, whether that's like gender discrimination. There are things that like prevent us from reaching the places that we can be. And so while we should build up the individual, I think it's so important to not forget at all about the role that we have to build up the people around us as well. And I think on the point of messaging, I think we sort of also have to change the way that we think about these things, because you're right, the story of the individual resonates with people. And I think it's an important story to tell, but we can't tell that story at the expense of other stories. Like if we think of most of our heroes, the way that change has happened in like movies, it's like one hero standing up to a group of people. When we think of big issues like climate action, it's not one person that's going to solve it. It's not Bill Gates that's going to give some money and then solve it. It's each one of us has to play a role in it. And I think creating space for stories like that allows us to move forward at a pace that like we've never seen before.
You mentioned Bill Gates. What are your opinions on Elon Musk? He obviously is electrifying at least the car industry. Seems to be electrifying the world. What do you think about, well, there's an individual, once again, it's not like he's going to single-handedly do it, obviously. But what are your takes on that, on Tesla? Do you think that that's going to fix a lot?
So I think Tesla is an interesting case. Like if we think of electric cars aren't actually the solution to everything. Like if we think of how we want our cities to function, we can't actually just replace gas cars with electric cars, because where is the energy for the electricity coming from? And what goes into like producing electric cars? There's a lot of lithium extraction that happens, and in, for example, South America, a lot of lithium extraction happens at mines. At these mines are often built on indigenous territory. They displace indigenous peoples. Workers aren't paid really well. If we think about that, that's not really just. Yes, we're reducing carbon emissions, but at the cost of sort of extracting a mineral from the environment at an unsustainable rate that's harming people around them. Like, my point is not that electric cars are bad at all. We need electric cars, but we need to think more carefully about how we produce sort of electric cars and how we create a society where we don't even need a car to walk. Like, you know, we're in Toronto, right? Like, we could have so much better public transit in Toronto, and then people wouldn't need cars in Toronto. Or like, think about the GTA. You're from Georgetown. Orangeville, yes. I knew that. Like, how do you get to Orangeville whenever you have to get there?
Dude.
Do you drive?
Dude, it's a mess. Yeah, just drive.
Right?
There's like 3 buses in the whole town.
Exactly. And, you know, we have GO trains. GO trains go to like, you know, east, west, north, south. They don't go that far, though. If we think of Via Rail, like, how long does it take to get from Toronto to Montreal by Via Rail? Like 6 hours?
Yeah.
5-6 hours. It's also a 5-hour drive. So if it's like 6 hours to get there by train, but 5 hours by driving, of course you drive. Like, and so if we can create transit, for example, that lets you go from Montreal to Toronto in 2 hours or 3 hours, let's be generous, 3 hours. Would you rather take an hour flight or a 3-hour train, knowing that the flight requires you to get there 2 hours early, check in your bags, you have a weight limit? Like, what would you rather do, plane or train?
Definitely the train would be shorter overall.
It'd be shorter. When you think about it. It'd be more efficient. Trains are just like that. You can stand up. You still have data.
Good views.
You can call people. Good views. Like trains, if we can build up a society where we have trains that function like that, that's amazing. And so that's why I think like the emphasis on electric cars can actually, again, take us away from the focus on things like city planning, transit, and think about how we design cities and communities and like countries that allow us to get around, that where we don't actually need cars. Because I'd rather be on a train than driving so that I could do work, so I can be productive, so I can do other things. And I'd rather be on the train than the plane too, because trains are usually in city centers, planes are usually far away. Like there's so many little things like that where it actually makes so much sense to build in a way that is actually more sustainable, not just for the sake of the climate, but for the sake of ourselves. and we can make intentional decisions to design our societies in that way.
That's interesting. And that's another thing that a lot of people wouldn't want to get on the train just because it's less private. There's a lot of privacy that people enjoy in the car.
Yeah.
Get to sing as loud as you want.
Yeah.
Get to rap awfully like I often do. I guess that kind of circles back into your whole break the divide thing. If people were more comfortable with the community and just less individualistic, like I guess Eastern cultures are much more, I guess, communal.
Collectivist, yeah.
Collectivist. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. Collectivist. Can that even be tackled though? It's like, I don't think that the issue is necessarily time that you're saving by going on the train. I think it's more there's an individualistic culture in the West and then a collectivistic in the East. Is that something that, like, that's a hard thing to really take down?
Yeah, like on the point about trains, I think it's that people feel like that people want more privacy, but like, why? Because we're used to that, right? Like, you're used to the convenience of being able to like stop at a gas station and get some snacks, to go to the bathroom, like to stop. But like, we're used to that, and we actually haven't fully explored what a different future can look like. And I think the exciting thing is that we can, because again, like when we think of leaving people behind, people should still have the option to drive from Toronto to Montreal. Like, again, let's say you have a disability, or you know that the train isn't going to be safe for you, or whatever reason you may not want to, like, you should have the option. And we shouldn't sort of shame people for their choices, but we should create systems and incentives. Like if there was like a bunch of tolls on the road from Toronto to Montreal and it actually costs more to drive, like add up the gas and add up the tolls than it does to take a train, then like you take a train, right? And so it's about like within our existing system of economics, what actually makes sort of economic sense, and like sort of thinking of incentives for people. But I think to your question about like value, it's really a question of values. Like, what do we value? And I think the thing is we can change the things that we value too. And we can do that by learning from other people. Just even like the beginning of seeing different ways that people can exist. When I was in Fiji, one of the things that people talked about was this idea of resilience after a natural disaster happens. That immediately after a flood happens, people come together as a community and they don't isolate. So if we contrast that with what happens, let's say in Toronto, there's a tornado. I don't know if Toronto doesn't get tornadoes.
There's a lot of big buildings. That'd be kind of hard to get started, but no, I know you mean.
You know, like, let's say Toronto has a big natural disaster. We all isolate to our own family unit, and that's okay. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but I'm saying that if we can create sort of broader ways of being that allow us to be together, then like people are going to do that because it's what's in front of you. And I guess what I'm saying is like, I think we just need to like diversify the options that we have all available. And I think this is an important part of like a discussion of like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about like the faces, what people look like. It's not just that. How do people think about different issues, and what are their values, and how can we learn from those? It doesn't mean that every value is good, but it means that right now we have a sort of dominant way of being that erases all other identities. How can we bring those other identities to the forefront and allow people to actually learn from the different ways that people think?
I get that. I think that a problem that some people might have is when you say that, I know you're just making an example, but I'll use the example.
No, that's okay.
If you put tolls on the road from Toronto to Montreal, that's going to make a lot of people mad, even if they don't mind going on the train.
Yeah.
They're just going to be like, I should be able to drive from point A to point B in my own country.
Yeah.
Without getting charged through the roof.
Totally.
So when do incentives, and this can come back to climate as well.
Yeah.
When do incentives really put, I guess, a damper on freedom almost?
Yeah, limitations on freedom. Like, here's the thing with that exact example, because I know, like, I didn't really think that much about that example.
You could use anything, like carbon tax, for example.
Yeah, anything. The thing is, we need to actually just take a step back and think, what are the incentives that are already in place, that we already sort of incentivize people to drive, because our entire infrastructure is built for that. Like, I think I read something somewhere that said that like every sort of stretch of highway or roads within cities is subsidized by taxpayers. Like, if you change sort of the roads in cities to like trains, again, using that same example, it would actually be a lot more cost effective. So yes, you might make a big change like adding tolls, actually, we need to realize that like there's something that's already subsidized. There's something that's already incentivized. Like the fossil fuel industry in Canada is already subsidized. Like if we think of agriculture and like the meat industry in America and Canada, it's subsidized. Like if we think of a lot of big banks and big companies during COVID that made record profits, they were subsidized by the governments. Our taxpayer dollars went there. So like things like the carbon tax, it's putting a price on like the thing that keeps our environment dangerous, right? And I think it's actually a values judgment. Like I think it makes sense to make people pay for causing harm to our environment, because it's going to make people pay eventually, whether you get lung cancer, whether your house is destroyed in a hurricane. Like there are so many things that we just don't connect actually. And I think looking at it from the limited worldview of like, this is what I already know. I already know that driving is normal. If someone changes that, that's immediately bad. I think we need to get out of that way of thinking. And I think like just in our conversation right now, we're talking about very sort of big ideas. I think when we talk to people that are impacted by these things, you need to start small. You need to talk about the very specific things that impact them, because like, I'm not saying you need to go out there and educate yourself on everything in the world. I don't know everything. That's not realistic. But if we can work with people and reach people where they are to help people understand that many of our goals are actually the same. The thing is right now, like to your point in the beginning about like everyone should be able to like say, I like cake. The problem is we don't have equal conditions, the starting point where we all can love cake. And so if we can create a society where we all have the information about like, okay, what goes into cake? Is it flour? Is it chocolate? Is it vanilla? Like whatever it is. If we can create those conditions where people are actually knowledgeable about the things around them and reach people where they're at, that creates a big difference.
And we'll end off with one more topic.
Yeah.
Mental health. It's something that you talk about a lot, you consider a lot. Break the Divide. Does Break the Divide talk about mental health?
Yeah, totally.
Climate change for some people, it affects that, but there are a lot of other reasons for sure.
Of course.
Why do you think that mental health is so much more of a prevalent or at least discussed issue in countries like Canada and the US, UK, like very well-off countries where you see more impoverished countries who have objectively a more difficult setup in life? These issues are not there. What is it about advanced societies like this that I mean, mental health is seeming to be now just a crazy thing?
Yeah, if we compare high-income countries with low-income countries, I think there's two things. One is sort of the language that we use to talk about mental health, and the second is sort of the prevalence of like what your needs are. If we think of the language around mental health, the thing is in many different cultures around the world, different words are used to describe what happiness means, what sadness is, what depression is. Some languages don't have a word for depression. Some languages don't have a word for like optimism. But it's interesting actually in our sort of Western American Psychological Association definition of, I think, happiness, there is no mention of the word peace. But in a survey of sort of hundreds of different cultures around the world talking about what happiness means to people, peace was actually one of the biggest things that came up time and time again. So it actually goes to show that maybe the ways that we talk about mental health here in Canada, it's not actually applicable to the rest of the world. So in order to like understand, do people actually have mental health concerns and how prevalent are they, you need to actually like use different words and use different language. So I think climate anxiety is a similar thing. It's that like people might not say that I'm anxious about the future, but they might be worried about the future of their farm or the future of their family. And those are actually similar things when you come down to sort of the physical impacts of those emotions. So I think on one level, when it comes to mental health, like if we think of sort of severe mental health issues like suicide, like depression, like anxiety, and things that build up and that are sort of like diagnosed in our system, those are things that like when we think about it, we have destigmatized it quite a bit too in the West, and we've been able to talk about it. I think that's the second issue, that like it's similar to the issue of climate change that we're talking about. When you have other needs that are sort of like more important or more directly impacted, like that you see more directly for those issues, then you're probably going to think and care about those more than the more abstract issues that you don't really see on a day-to-day basis. And I think mental health is stigmatized in a lot of different cultures and a lot of different places. It still is here in sort of high-income countries as well. And I think, again, it's the work that we can do to sort of destigmatize mental health, recognize that everyone does have mental health and we all go through challenges, and people have different challenges that are related to mental health. Sometimes it's like biological, sometimes it's clinical. Many times it's systemic factors that result in people having poor mental health. I think it's a matter of language and actual like physical conditions in many places.
Language, that you brought up an interesting point, how some languages don't even have a word for depression.
Yeah.
Now, to some people, that might sound like a bad thing. That might sound like, people want to know if there is something wrong with them.
Yeah.
If they have a condition, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But is there something to be said about these languages that they don't even have the word for it? So these people might not even believe in it. They're never thinking about the issue. Whereas in a country like Canada, it's brought up so often. How can you avoid it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know, honestly.
Yeah.
I guess brainstorming out loud, maybe there's two ways to look at it. One being that it is a good thing, like you said, and like people don't identify with it because they don't see it, or like it's not something that you're sort of supposed to be. But I think with that exact thing, it could actually be a bad thing where like, if you're not supposed to be that way, but you still feel like a deep sense of like emptiness, you feel grief, you feel powerless, you feel no energy. Like if you feel that and those symptoms line up with depression, but you don't have the words to describe it, then it's like you actually feel left out and you feel more alone. And that's what can actually cause more mental health issues to become worse, when you feel alone and when you feel like there's no way out. So I think in our societies where we're able to like talk about mental health more, like people feel less alone and people know that there are options for care and support and they're not alone. Like I think that feeling of not being alone is so important, and we can't overestimate how important that is. Like there's this term, it's a bit of a fancy term called hermeneutical injustice. And this refers to the injustice of not even knowing what's happening in society that makes you feel bad. And so therefore you actually lose the privilege of being able to address it. Like if you don't know what's wrong, you can't address it. Like if you don't know that, if you don't know that you're supposed to eat fresh fruits in order to maintain a healthy diet, and then you eat as you're normally eating, or actually here's a better example. If you don't have access to any fresh fruits at a financially viable cost around you, but you don't know that that's a problem, that's hermeneutical injustice, that you don't actually realize what the problem is, and therefore you can't take action. So I think when it comes to mental health, you can also think about it in that way, that like there is so much power in being able to give language to something that someone's experiencing, because it allows them to identify with other people and create community. And in community, you build solidarity and the ability to take broader action.
Very, very well spoken. I could go on for so much longer.
This was fun.
Did we get a knock? She wants to come in.
Oh, we're out of time. I could talk longer with you, Carter.
This has been fun.
We barely talked about like hockey and sports and school, and like I think I told you I'd be super interested in talking about like spirituality too. Like,
dude, there's so many more topics. If they don't come by, last closing topic. This has been just amazing. We could go on for so much longer.
Yeah.
But are the Canucks going to get Bedard?
Oh, God. Oh, God. No.
They want him.
Yes. I mean, I want the Canucks to get Bedard. I think they're fifth last in the league right now. I think Arizona actually lost a few games, so they're back behind us.
We need Montreal to get below you guys.
No, this is the thing. I think I was reading that the Canucks have the third easiest schedule left in the league, and so that means that we might win a bunch of games. But if the Canucks trade Luke Schenn, Brock Besser, and they don't activate Thatcher Demko, then like we could lose a lot of games. But Demko's supposed to come back, so
the coach is just like, yeah, you're still hurt a little bit.
I
bash his leg maybe.
As I think about the issues of the world and climate change and all these big issues, like the Canucks, I'm hopeful.
Yeah,
I think there's a chance that we can get Bedard this year, and I will hope until it happens, or until I'm proven wrong.
Well, we definitely have more topics. Unfortunately, out of time. If maybe we could do this some other time, do it again. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Happy
man.
to do a part two.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Carter. This was fun.
Thanks for coming on.
This was fun.
See you guys later. That was great.
That was awesome, man.